What if everything you thought you knew about fasting was only giving you half the picture? Not the wrong picture, not a lie, just an incomplete one. And here is the uncomfortable truth about incomplete maps. When you follow them long enough, you do not just stop making progress. You actually start drifting in the wrong direction without even realizing it. The worst part is it looks like discipline from the outside. It looks like you are doing everything right. You are showing up, staying consistent, and following the rules. But underneath the surface, your body is quietly shifting in ways you never intended and never saw coming. That is what we are here to talk about today. The fasting advice that exploded 5 or 6 years ago was built on early science. Promising science, genuinely exciting science, but science that had massive gaps nobody was honest about at the time. Since then, researchers have gone much deeper. Practitioners have spent years doing real trial and error in the trenches with real people and real results. What came out the other side looks very different from what most people are still practicing today. The 16-8 window every single day. Crush insulin at all costs. Skip breakfast forever. Fast to burn fat. These were the commandments, and millions of smart, well-intentioned people followed them religiously while unknowingly working against themselves. That ends today. Let us start with the biggest shift, and this one is going to challenge something you probably consider your greatest strength. We used to treat fasting as a daily routine, something predictable, something you did the same way every single morning without fail. And that felt like the whole point. Pick your window, eat inside it, fast outside it, and repeat forever. On paper, it sounds perfectly logical. You restrict calories, you create a habit, you stay consistent. But here is the problem with that thinking, and it is a problem rooted deep in your own biology. Your body is not interested in your routine. Your body is only interested in survival, and survival means adaptation. When you do the exact same thing every single day without any variation, your body does exactly what hundreds of thousands of years of evolution designed it to do. It figures out your rhythm. It maps your pattern. It starts conserving energy to match this new predictable normal. You have handed it on a silver platter. And slowly, so slowly you barely notice it happening, your metabolic rate begins drifting quietly downward. That is not a theory or a hypothesis. That is your physiology doing precisely what it was built to do under conditions of predictable, repeated stress. Once you truly understand this, daily fasting the same way every single day starts to feel less like optimization and more like a slow metabolic leak you created yourself. The shift we need to make is treating fasting as a spike, as a shock, as a deliberate interruption rather than a daily, comfortable habit your metabolism has completely mastered and adapted to already. Keep your baseline solid. Eat 3 real, genuinely nutritious, properly timed meals on most days of the week. And then occasionally, without warning, pull the rug completely out from underneath your body's expectations. Fast longer and harder on certain strategic days, then go immediately right back to normal eating the very next day. That unpredictability is not a weakness in your strategy. That unpredictability is the entire strategy. Your body simply cannot adapt to something it cannot predict. And that inability to predict is exactly where the real metabolic magic lives. When fasting becomes a shock rather than a memorized pattern, the body has no choice but to scramble and respond to it. That scramble is not something to be afraid of. That scramble is precisely where the real benefits are hiding. 2 or 3 longer fasts per week, paired with simple 12-hour overnight fasts on the other days, works remarkably well for most people. It is not overly restrictive, not obsessive, not unsustainable. It is just enough deliberate disruption to keep your metabolism from settling into a comfortable, energy-conserving, completely predictable routine that stops serving your actual goals long term. Now let us talk about the ancestral framework, because it absolutely dominated fasting conversations for years, and it still shows up constantly in online communities and health spaces today. What did our ancestors do? They fasted when food was unavailable. They feasted when it was available. Feast and famine. That was the model everyone was trying to replicate. And look, there is genuine wisdom buried in that framework. Our biology really was shaped by scarcity over millennia, and that history lives inside our cells right now in very real and measurable ways. But here is the part that almost always gets quietly left out of that conversation, and it matters enormously. We are not our ancestors. Not in any literal, practical, day-to-day sense that actually matters for how we live right now. We do not hunt for meals. We do not sleep outside in freezing temperatures. We do not walk 10 miles before dawn just to find clean water before the actual day even begins. We sit in temperature-controlled offices. We drive climate-controlled cars. We can have food delivered directly to our front door in under 30 minutes without standing up from the couch. That is our reality, and the environmental pressures that made ancestral fasting both necessary and survivable are almost entirely absent from modern daily life. That changes everything about how we should be applying these principles today in any intelligent way. And more importantly, we have something our ancestors never once had access to in their entire lives. We have conscious tools, the ability to deliberately intervene and adjust our own biology in real time whenever we choose to do so. Here's a practical example of what that actually means in your daily life. When you fast for an extended period, cortisol rises. That is your stress response mobilizing energy, because your body genuinely believes food is scarce right now and survival is uncertain. In modern life, that cortisol spike layers directly on top of an already chronically stressed nervous system and pushes you into a state that stops being helpful and starts becoming genuinely harmful over time. Your ancestral self would have had to wait it out, waiting until food was physically found somewhere in the wild. But you can walk to your kitchen right now and have a single tablespoon of honey. That small amount of carbohydrate sends an immediate signal to your brain that you are safe, that fuel is available, and that the cortisol response can stand completely down because the threat of starvation is simply not real right now in your life. You can flip that biological switch on purpose, deliberately, with full awareness and full control over the outcome. That is not cheating on your fast. That is using intelligence and available tools rather than pretending they do not exist just to feel more hardcore about your protocol. Now let us talk about how we used to view fasting purely as a fat loss tool, because this mindset did a tremendous amount of quiet damage to people who were genuinely trying to get healthier. And yes, fasting absolutely does contribute to fat loss. That part of the picture is completely real, and it is not going anywhere. When you are fasting, your body shifts toward oxidizing fat for fuel. Insulin drops, fat cells become more accessible, fatty acids get mobilized into the bloodstream. All of that is genuinely happening during your fast, and it is meaningful and real. But framing fasting purely as a fat loss tool reduces something incredibly complex down to a single outcome, and it keeps people locked inside a calories in, calories out obsession that does real psychological damage over time that is hard to undo. Here is where the science has genuinely shifted its focus in recent years. Fasting is a signal, not a restriction mechanism, not a calorie-cutting tool. It is a biological signal that your body interprets and then responds to in powerful, wide-reaching ways that go far beyond the number on your scale. When you fast, you send your body a very specific set of instructions. You trigger antioxidant systems that protect cells from oxidative damage. You downregulate inflammatory pathways that quietly drive chronic disease progression over years and decades. You modulate cortisol rhythms. You nudge your circadian biology back into better alignment with how it was designed to function. The fast is the stimulus. The body's adaptation to that stimulus is the actual benefit you are chasing, and that benefit reaches into every corner of your health. When you understand fasting as a signal rather than a restriction, something important shifts in how you approach food. You stop obsessing over calories and start thinking about the quality of the signal instead. Eat well during your eating window. Eat real, genuinely nourishing food that your body actually recognizes and knows how to use. Do not white-knuckle through calorie deficits 7 days a week with no break, no recovery, and no reprieve from the constant pressure of restriction ever. Occasionally and deliberately remove food for a meaningful stretch of time. Then let your body do what it does extraordinarily well when given the right signal. It adapts. It recalibrates. It comes back operating better than before. That is the entire game when you understand it properly. This connects directly to something else that needs updating in how most people are thinking about this. The old pitch for fasting was simple and easy to sell. Skip breakfast. Cut a third of your daily calories. Done, easy, repeatable, convenient, and not entirely wrong either. Skipping a meal does reduce caloric intake, and that has some genuine benefit in certain contexts for certain people. But it is far too narrow a lens for understanding what fasting is really doing inside your body. The more we learn about the nervous system and its relationship to eating behavior, the clearer this becomes, and it changes the conversation in ways most people are completely unprepared for. When you fast, you are not just cutting calories. You are directly influencing your nervous system state in ways that ripple out into everything from your stress hormones to your sleep quality to your emotional regulation throughout the day. Here is the core problem with being in a constant state of caloric restriction day after day without ever genuinely breaking that cycle. It activates your sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight branch, the emergency system designed for short-term crises, not for building long-term health, not for thriving over years and decades in any meaningful, sustainable way. When you are chronically in that activated state, obsessing over macros and cutting calories at every meal and white-knuckling through hunger constantly, you keep your body in low-grade physiological stress around the entire clock. That is not a sustainable foundation for health, and it is a huge part of why most people cannot stay on restrictive diets for very long. Their body is not failing them. Their body is actively fighting back, and evolution has made that fight remarkably one-sided in the body's favor every single time. The modern and far more effective shift is toward using fasting as a nervous system intervention rather than a calorie-cutting machine. The goal is not just removing calories from your day. The goal is creating meaningful periods of deep parasympathetic recovery alongside deliberate and strategic sympathetic activation when the timing is genuinely right. Fast hard on certain days. Eat really well the rest of the time. Let your nervous system breathe between the harder fasting days and watch how differently your body responds over months rather than days. Now let us talk about autophagy, because it became one of the most exciting and simultaneously most misunderstood concepts the wellness world has ever encountered. And that misunderstanding has quietly led a lot of well-intentioned people in completely the wrong direction without them ever realizing it. The science behind autophagy is real, and it is remarkable. When you fast for extended periods, your body initiates a deep cellular cleanup process. It breaks down damaged proteins. It clears out dysfunctional cellular material that is no longer serving any useful purpose. It recycles that broken down material into usable building blocks for repair. It is essentially your body's internal maintenance crew finally showing up to do their work once the constant noise and metabolic activity of digestion quiet down enough to let them operate. But here is where the public conversation went sideways in a way that cost people real results over real time. People started treating the fast itself as the repair. Get through the fast, trigger the autophagy, check the box, and mission accomplished. The reality is far more nuanced and far more important than that oversimplified story. Fasting is the signal that initiates the breakdown, the cleanup, and the demolition of what is damaged and no longer needed. But the actual rebuilding, the actual repair and regeneration, that happens when you eat afterward. When you provide adequate protein, the right minerals, vitamins, and nutrients during your eating window, that is when the construction crew finally arrives to complete the work the demolition team started. Without that second phase, you are beginning a full renovation project and never purchasing any of the building materials needed to finish it. The practical shift here is significant and worth taking seriously. Obsess less about what you do during the fast itself. Obsess more, far more, about what you eat when the fast is finally over. That is where your real attention belongs and where real results are actually built. Quality protein, real whole food, adequate total calories, proper minerals. The eating window is not the enemy of your fast. It is the essential other half of the equation that makes everything else work properly. Without taking that second half seriously, fasting becomes damage without recovery. And that is a recipe for eventually feeling worse rather than progressively and reliably feeling better over time. Here is one that genuinely caught a lot of people off guard and still causes confusion in nearly every fasting community online. We used to think the entire goal was to keep insulin as low as possible for as long as possible, using every available tool at all times. And the logic behind that thinking is sound on the surface. Chronically elevated insulin does drive fat storage. It does impair fat oxidation over time. It does contribute to insulin resistance that creates serious long-term metabolic problems. Getting insulin down has real, well-documented benefits backed by legitimate science, and nobody informed is arguing against that. But the approach that evolved from that understanding went too far in a direction that created entirely new problems while people were busy solving the original ones. Suppress insulin as aggressively as possible for as long as possible. No carbohydrates, maximum fasting, and avoid anything that raises blood sugar at any cost. That became the operating philosophy for enormous numbers of people, and it missed something critically important that changed the entire outcome. Insulin is not just a storage hormone to be feared and suppressed forever. Insulin is a signaling molecule, and signaling molecules work best when their signal stays clear, strong, and responsive. When you chronically suppress insulin through constant fasting and obsessive avoidance of glucose, something unexpected begins to happen that most people never see coming. The signal gets foggy. Your body's ability to respond appropriately to insulin when it is actually present begins to degrade over time. You are not building insulin sensitivity. You are just avoiding the test entirely and calling that an improvement. The updated framework is about refreshing the signal intelligently rather than trying to eliminate it permanently. Fast periodically to let insulin drop in a meaningful way. Then eat, including some strategic carbohydrates, and let the body practice responding correctly to that signal. Even just 20 or 30 grams of carbohydrate after a longer fast can blunt a cortisol spike meaningfully, shift the nervous system toward parasympathetic, and help your body transition out of the stressed fasted state gracefully and completely. That is not a failure of discipline or willpower. That is intelligent biological communication with a body that is constantly listening to every signal you send it, interpreting each one, and responding accordingly whether you intend it to or not. Let us also address the fat-burning piece directly, because it was a massive part of how fasting was originally sold to the mainstream audience, and it shaped how millions of people still think about this today. Fasting was marketed as the path to becoming a fat-burning machine. Train your mitochondria to use fat. Stay in fat oxidation mode as much as humanly possible. Minimize glucose dependence entirely if you can manage it. And there is real value in developing the ability to efficiently burn fat. That is absolutely true and worth pursuing. But optimizing exclusively for fat oxidation comes with a trade-off that almost nobody talked about openly. A trade-off that shows up quietly over months of aggressive protocol adherence and catches people completely off guard when it finally arrives. When you spend extended time heavily favoring fat burning and consistently suppressing glucose metabolism, your body gradually loses some of its ability to handle carbohydrates effectively. Glucose tolerance begins to decline. The metabolic machinery responsible for processing carbohydrates gets less and less practice and becomes less and less efficient over time. This has been reported consistently by people who spent long stretches on carnivore diets, extreme low-carb protocols, or very aggressive fasting schedules that never included meaningful carbohydrate reintroduction at any point along the way. High cortisol, reduced glucose tolerance, a metabolism so deeply adapted to one fuel source that it genuinely struggles to use the other one when the situation calls for it. The actual goal, the real goal the science now points toward clearly, is metabolic flexibility, the ability to burn fat when fat is appropriate and use glucose when glucose is appropriate and switch smoothly between both without friction or dysfunction. So what does all of this actually look like in daily practice? Because philosophy has to land somewhere real and actionable that you can apply to your actual life starting today. Every single day, maintain a minimum 12-hour overnight fast as your baseline floor. Finish eating by 7 p.m. Do not eat again until 7 a.m. Nothing complicated, nothing extreme, just a consistent daily rhythm that maintains a basic biological reset without creating excessive stress or disruption. That simple habit aligns with your body's natural overnight repair processes in a way that supports rather than fights your existing biology and costs you almost nothing in terms of lifestyle sacrifice. 2 days every week extend that fast to something closer to 20 hours. These become your shock days, the days where your body receives a meaningful and unexpected jolt that forces real adaptation at the cellular level. On one of those days, skip the first meal. On the other longer fasting day, skip the last meal of the evening instead. Alternating which end of the day gets removed keeps your body from finding and locking into a new, predictable pattern that it can adapt to and neutralize. When you finally break a longer fast, the first meal matters more than most people realize and should be deliberately designed to support a smooth and productive transition back into the fed state. Simple clean starch, a little raw honey, quality protein, and bone broth together send your nervous system exactly the right message that safety has returned, fuel is available, and rebuilding can begin in earnest. Here is the bigger picture that ties every one of these shifts together into something coherent and actionable and genuinely worth building your health around for the long term. Fasting works. That has not changed, and it will not change, because the underlying biology is powerful and real. But why it works, how to use it strategically, and what to do around it has evolved in ways that matter deeply for your actual outcomes. The evolution points clearly and consistently in one direction, away from rigidity, away from obsession, away from the illusion that you can force your biology into permanent submission through sheer willpower and increasingly aggressive restriction every single day of your life. The people who will get the most from fasting going forward will not be the ones who fast the longest or the most aggressively every week. They will be the ones who understand what fasting is actually doing at the biological level, who know when to apply it, how hard to push it, and equally important, when to step back completely, eat well, and let the body do what billions of years of evolution have prepared it to do with remarkable precision. Update your thinking. Eat with real intention. Fast strategically rather than out of habit or fear. And trust the biology you have been carrying your entire life, because it already knows exactly what to do when you finally give it the right signals at the right times.